Hi and welcome. It's a November night on the Great Plains sometime in the 1840s. The temperature has dropped to 10 below zero. Wind sweeps across endless grassland, carrying the promise of snow miles. From any shelter you might recognize, a cluster of cone-shaped dwellings sits against the vast darkness tipis, their buffalo hide walls, the only barrier between sleeping families and a cold that could kill. How did they do it? How did entire communities survive? Not just survive, but live full, complex lives through brutal plains, winters, in what appears to be nothing more than animal skins stretched over wooden poles? The answer lies in forgotten knowledge, in skills passed down through generations, in an understanding of warmth and shelter so profound it challenges everything we think we know about comfort and survival. Before we dive in, I need a quick favor. Tap that like button if you're ready to step back in time with me tonight, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss our late night journeys into history's forgotten corners. Let's make this a real community moment. Drop a comment right now and tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it for you? Maybe some of you are up late in the US, others just waking up in Europe or tuning in from somewhere halfway across the world. I love seeing how far this little circle of time travelers can reach because, trust me, what comes next is a story you won't want to miss. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background. And let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. We're traveling to a world where staying warm wasn't a matter of turning a dial, but an art form practiced every single day, where the difference between comfort and catastrophe lay in knowledge. Your grandmother's grandmother carried in her bones. Late October 1847, Lakota winter camp, along the Powder River. The sky is the color of old putter, heavy and low, promising snow. Before morning, you can taste it in the air, that metallic bite that makes your teeth ache. Your breath forms small clouds as you work, hands already stiff, despite the buffalo hide mittens your mother made you last spring. You are 16 winters, old enough to shoulder real responsibility, but young enough that your body still rebels against the cold. Today, like every day since the leaves began to fall, your survival depends on 100 small tasks performed exactly right. The wind moans across the prairie, carrying the scent of dying grass and distant snow. It finds every gap, every loose tie in your clothing, between your moccasins and leggings at your wrists, where hide meets skin around your neck. Despite the fur-dot collar pulled high, the wind is alive out here, hungry and searching, always looking for warmth to steal. Your first task this morning was gathering fuel, buffalo chips, the dried dung that burns slow and steady. You've been collecting them since before dawn, filling your pa flesh bag with the brown discs that will keep your family's fire alive through another night. Your fingers are numb inside your mittens as you work, but you know each chip by feel. The old ones crumble useless. The ones from summer are hard as wood, perfect for long burns. The chips that fell in the last rain are too damp, but you gather them anyway, knowing they'll dry by the fire. Nothing can be wasted out here on the vast emptiness of the plains. Waste equals death. Imagine yourself crouched beside the teepee. Your family calls home 20 buffalo hides, sewn together with scents, stretched over 15 lodge poles, each 20 ft tall. The entire structure could be taken down and packed in less than an hour, but right now it's your universe, 12 ft across at the base, tapering to about a smoke hole at the top where you can see a patch of grey sky. Your mother emerges from the entrance, the hide flap falling, shut behind her with a soft whisper. She carries a buffalo porch filled with water steam, rising from its surface. Even this simple task, heating water, requires constant attention. The porch hangs from a tripod over the central fire, and if the flames get too high, the container will burn through too low, and the water will never boil. She nods toward the woodpile, and you know what she means without words. The cottonwood branches you gathered yesterday are running low. Your stomach clenches, not from hunger, though that's always present this time of year, but from the knowledge that today you'll have to venture farther from camp, maybe a mile or more to the creek bottom, where dead wood might still be found. The adult men left 3 days ago, following tracks of a small buffalo herd spotted to the west. They might return with meat that will fill every belly in the camp, or they might return with nothing but stories of animals that moved too fast, of weather that turned too cold, of luck that ran out when it was needed most. You've learned not to hope too hard, but the taste of pumpkin and dried berries gets old when it's all you have. You shoulder the leather bag used for wood gathering. It's made from an entire deer hide, tanned until it's soft as cloth, but strong enough to hold an armload of frozen branches. The strap cuts into your shoulder through your shirt. A shirt sewn from the hide of an elk your father killed 2 summers ago, decorated with your sister's careful beadwork, in patterns that tell the story of your family's medicine. Walking to the creek means leaving the relative warmth of the camp, where dozens of fires create their own microclimate. Out here, sheltered by the bend in the river and surrounded by tipis, the temperature might be 5 or 10 degrees warmer than the open prairie. But away from this bubble of human heat, winter waits with infinite patience. Your moccasins punch through the thin crust of snow with each step. The soles are double thick, buffalo hide with the hair left on the inside, but still you feel every frozen root, every hidden stone. Your feet stay warm as long as you keep moving, but standing still for even a few minutes means pain shooting up from your toes. The creek is beautiful and terrible. Ice has formed along the edges, but the center still runs black and swift. Steam rises where the slightly warmer water meets air that's well below freezing. The cottonwoods stand like pale ghosts, their bark white and smooth, their branches rattling in the wind like old bones. Here you find what you're looking for: dead fall branches, some as thick as your wrist, others no bigger than your thumb. All of it will burn. All of it is precious. You work methodically, breaking the longer pieces across your knee, loading the bag until it's almost too heavy to lift. But weight means warmth tonight. Weight means the fire that keeps your grandfather's old lungs clear, that keeps your baby cousin from the kind of cold that kills infants in their sleep. That keeps the pot of stew simmering slowly, so there's always something warm to put in an empty belly. The walk back to camp is harder. The bag pulls at your shoulder, and sweat begins to freeze at your hairline. Despite the cold, you can see smoke rising from the teepees long before. You can see the dwellings themselves, thin streams of white and grey that dissipate quickly in the wind but mark the locations of life, of warmth, of home. By the time you reach your family's lodge, your mother has already begun the evening preparations. The buffalo hide lining the inner wall that doesn't quite reach the ground has been adjusted to force airflow up and around the living space. This creates a chimney, effect that draws smoke up through the opening at the top, while keeping the worst of the cold from flowing down. She's also spread fresh sage and sweet grass on the floor, plants that will release their scent when walked on and help mask the inevitable odor of two. Many people living in too small a space. Your family's winter lodge houses 8 people. Your parents, grandparents, yourself, 2 younger sisters, and a baby cousin whose parents died in the spotted sickness 3 summers ago. 8 people means 8 bodies generating heat, but it also means 8 people breathing. 8 people producing moisture that can freeze on the inner walls if the ventilation isn't managed perfectly. Your mother has spent years learning to read the subtle signs, when to open the smoke flaps wider, when to adjust the inner lining, when to build up the fire and when to let it burn low. You dump the wood beside the fire pit and immediately the familiar comfort of the lodge wraps around you like a warm robe. The difference is extraordinary. Outside your breath-formed clouds, but inside the air is warm enough that you can speak without seeing your words. The fire burns in a carefully constructed pit lined with stones. the flames never more than 2 ft high, but steady and constant. Around the fire, your family sits in their established places. The area directly across from the entrance, the place of honor, belongs to your grandfather. Your grandmother sits to his right, your parents to the left. You and your sisters occupy the spaces near the door, the coolest spots, but also the places where young people are expected to sit ready to tend the fire, to run errands, to help with whatever the adults need. The floor is layered with buffalo robes, the hair side up for warmth, creating a carpet that insulates your body from the frozen ground. Beneath, under these visible robes, lie more layers, willow branch mattresses that create air spaces for insulation, then more hides, then finally the hard earth. Your grandfather is working by firelight, his weathered hands shaping arrows from ash wood. Each shaft must be perfectly straight, perfectly balanced. The work requires patience and skill, and it keeps his mind occupied during the long winter nights when hunting stories have all been told and the wind outside sounds like the voices of spirits. Your grandmother tends a stew that's been simmering since morning. Smell fills the lodge, wild onions, prairie turnips and precious pieces of dried buffalo meat. She stirs with a horn spoon, tasting, adding a pinch of wild sage tasting again. The pot itself is a marvel of craftsmanship, made from the stomach lining of a buffalo, waterproofed and shaped to hold several gallons. This is the rhythm of winter days, work that must be done to maintain life, performed in the warm circle of family, always with one ear listening to the wind outside. The sounds tell you everything you need to know about the night to come. A steady moan means the weather will hold. Sharp gusts that make the lodge poles creak mean a storm building. Silence means the kind of cold that can kill. As darkness falls completely, your mother begins banking the fire for the night. This is perhaps the most critical skill of all, keeping enough heat to prevent freezing death while conserving fuel that must last until morning. Too much fire means waking in a lodge filled with smoke. Too little means waking not at all. She arranges the coals in a pattern learned from her mother, placing the largest pieces where they'll burn slowest, creating a bed of embers that will hold heat for hours around the fire pit. She places stones that have been heating all day. These will radiate warmth long after the flames die down. The sleeping arrangements are a careful choreography of warmth, sharing and respect. Your grandfather and grandmother sleep closest to the fire, wrapped in the heaviest robes. Your parents sleep on one side of the lodge, you and your sisters on the other, with the baby cousin between you, where she can benefit from multiple bodies' heat. Each person has their own sleeping robe buffalo hide, with the hair left on, tanned until it's soft and pliable. But these individual robes overlap and connect, creating a communal envelope of warmth. Your feet point toward the fire, your head toward the outer wall, where the cold is most intense, but your body heat mingles with that of your family. Before sleep, there are rituals that help ensure survival through the night. Your mother checks the door flap, making sure it's tied securely, but with just enough gap to prevent carbon monoxide from building up inside the lodge. Your father adjusts the smoke hole cover, a crucial calculation based on wind direction, fire intensity, and outside temperature. Your grandmother recites the prayers that have been said in lodges like this for countless generations. Words of gratitude for another day of life, requests for protection through the dark hours, acknowledgement of the forces that could easily sweep all of you away if they chose. As you pull your robe tight around your shoulders, you're acutely aware of the thin barrier between life and death. Afterway, the temperature is cold enough to kill an exposed person in hours. The wind that sounds like a living thing could easily tear apart the structure that shelters you. The fire that keeps you alive could just as easily burn everything you own. Yet here, in this small space, heated by wood and buffalo chips, warmed by breath and bodies and carefully tended flames, life continues. Your youngest sister tells a story she heard from the old women. her voice soft and drowsy. Your baby cousin makes small sleeping sounds. Your grandfather's breathing deepens into the rhythm of dreams. Outside, the wind carries the scent of snow and the promise of a storm that might last for days. Inside, the fire settles into a steady glow. The stones radiate their stored heat, and 8 people maintain a tiny pocket of warmth. In a world that seems designed to extinguish all traces of life, this is what survival looks like. Not the dramatic struggles of movies and books, but the quiet, constant vigilance of people who understand that comfort is temporary, that warmth must be earned every day, that the difference between life and death often comes down to whether someone remembered to gather enough fuel, whether the fire was banked correctly, whether the lodge was positioned to shelter its occupants from the prevailing winds. You close your eyes and listen to the familiar sounds of your family settling for sleep, the whisper of robes being adjusted, the soft murmur of your parents' voices, the snap and hiss of the dying fire. Tomorrow will bring the same challenges, the same careful balance of survival tasks, but tonight, surrounded by the people who share your life and your fate, you are warm enough to sleep. The last thing you hear before unconsciousness takes you is your grandfather's voice, barely a whisper, offering thanks to the spirits of the buffalo who gave their hides. For your shelter, their fuel for your fire, their meat for your strength. In the morning, if you're lucky, you'll wake to do it all again, as the embers of one life settle into glowing memory. Let us drift toward another story, one preserved in the careful words of a woman who lived these winters and chose to share their secrets before they vanished. Forever. Her name was Tahini, though the white traders and government men called her Buffalo Bird. Woman born in 1839 along the Missouri River, she lived through 82 winters, and in her old age she sat with anthropologists and historians patiently translating a lifetime of survival knowledge into words that could be written down and preserved. Picture her in 1918, an elderly woman with hands that remember everything. The exact tension needed to scrape a buffalo hide, the precise angle for sewing, scents, the feeling of cottonwood bark between her fingers as she gathered it for her horses. She speaks slowly, choosing each word with care, knowing that she is one of the last people who learned these skills as a child, who lived them as natural as breathing. Her voice carries the weight of witnessed history. She had seen the great herds that once stretched beyond the horizon, had felt the earth tremble under millions of hooves, had watched the last wild buffalo disappear into memory and museum exhibits. She had lived through the treaty years, the reservation years, the boarding school years that tried to erase everything she knew. Yet here she sits, determined that the knowledge should survive, even if the way of life could not. The tipi, she tells her listeners, was not just shelter. It was a system. Let yourself drift back with her to a winter when she was 12 years old, staying with her Lakota relatives on the Western Plains. The year was 1851, and her people had been invited to join a winter hunt following the great buffalo herds that still darkened the prairie like moving storms. She remembered the preparation that began in late summer, not just the hunting and the meat-making, but the careful selection and treatment of hides that would become winter lodges. The buffalo cow hides chosen for teepee covers had to be perfect. No holes from arrows or lance points, no scars from battles with wolves, no weak spots where parasites had damaged the skin. The selection process itself was an art form. Experienced women could determine a hide suitability from 50 paces reading the animal's age, in the grain of the hair, its health, in the colour and texture of the skin. They preferred cows that had lived 3 to 5 winters, old enough for thick, strong hides, but not so old that the skin had begun to lose its elasticity. Bulls with their thicker but less pliable hides were used for different purposes: ground coverings, storage containers, the heavy-duty items that needed strength more than flexibility. My grandmother, Buffalo Bird Woman, recalled, could look at a freshly killed buffalo and know immediately if its hide would make a good lodge cover. She would run her hands over the skin, feeling for thickness, for elasticity, for the subtle signs that meant this hide would shed water, would hold its shape through wind and snow, would last through the kind of winter that killed people. The grandmother in question was a woman named Corn Silk, whose own grandmother had been present at the first treaty meetings with Louis and Clark. Corn Silk had learned hide preparation from women who remembered when metal tools were rare, when everything was accomplished with implements of stone and bone and wood. She could grade a buffalo hide by touch alone. Her weathered fingers, reading the skin like others, read written words. The process of turning raw hide into shelter took weeks. First came the fleshing, scraping away every bit of meat and fat with tools made from sharpened buffalo leg bones. Buffalo, Bird Woman's hands would be raw and bleeding by the end of each day. But this work could not be rushed. Any fat left on the hide would turn rancid and rot the skin from within. The fleshing tools themselves were marvels of engineering, shaped from the leg bones of mature bulls and sharpened to a precise angle that could remove flesh without cutting through the hide itself. Different bones served different purposes. The broader tools for initial rough scraping, the narrower ones for detail, work around the edges and in the creases where fat-like to hide. Each woman owned several sets, carefully maintained and jealously guarded, often passed down through generations of mothers and daughters. Then came the braining, rubbing the hide with a mixture made from the buffalo's own brain, worked into a paste with bone marrow and prairie sage. This process, repeated over several days, transformed the stiff raw hide into something supple and waterproof. The women worked in groups singing the old songs that kept the rhythm of their movements steady, their voices mixing with the sound of scraping tools and the constant prairie wind. The brain tanning process was based on chemistry that the women understood intuitively rather than scientifically. Buffalo brains contain natural enzymes that break down the proteins that make untreated hide stiff and brittle, mixed with marrow fat. These enzymes penetrated deep into the skin fibers, creating a leather that remained soft and pliable even after repeated wetting and drying. The prairie sage added natural antibacterial properties and a pleasant scent that would help preserve the hide over years of use. The hide had to be worked every day while it cured, she explained, her aged voice still carrying the memory of aching muscles. If you let it sit too long, it would stiffen and crack. If you worked it too fast, it would tear. Everything had to be just right, or your family would freeze. This daily working was a communal activity that brought the women together in the late afternoons, when the heat of the day was fading, but there was still enough light to see clearly. They would stretch the hides on wooden frames and work them with smooth stones, gradually breaking down the fibers until the leather became as soft as cloth. Children would help by holding edges taut or by gathering the prairie sage that was rubbed into the hide during the final stages of curing. Young Buffalo Bird Woman learned by watching, by helping with the easier tasks, by making mistakes that her grandmother corrected with patient hands. She learned that different parts of the hide had different qualities. The thick skin along the buffalo's backbone was perfect for the bottom of the tipi, where it would receive the most wear, while the thinner belly hide was used higher up, where flexibility was more important than durability. The learning process extended beyond mere technique. Each step in hide preparation was accompanied by stories, songs and prayers that gave the work meaning beyond its practical function. Buffalo Bird Woman learned that the animals gave their lives to provide shelter and that every part of the hide-making process was an act of gratitude and respect. Waste was not just impractical, it was spiritually offensive. She learned to read weather in the behavior of drying hides, to judge humidity by how quickly the brain solution penetrated the skin, to time the work by the movement of shadows across the camp. These were skills that connected her to the rhythms of the natural world in ways that went far deeper than simple survival technique. When the hides were finally ready, the women would lay them out in a precise pattern, marking where each piece would be cut and sewn. A typical tipi required 12 to 15 hides, depending on the size, and every seam had to be perfect. They used sign thread, long tendons from the buffalo's legs, carefully cleaned and split into strands, finer than modern sewing thread. The cutting patterns for tipis were mathematical marvels worked out over generations of trial and error to create a structure that would shed wind and rain while providing maximum interior space. The basic shape was a complex cone, but each panel had to be precisely sized and shaped to create the smooth curves that gave the tipi its aerodynamic properties. Master seamstresses carried these patterns in their memories, able to lay out the cuts for a 20th tipi without measuring tools relying on proportions. Learned so thoroughly, they had become instinctive. The sewing, Buffalo Bird Woman remembered, was done with bone needles, and every stitch had to be tight, and even water would find any gap, any loose place. And once water got in, it would freeze and make the hole bigger. A poorly sewn tipi was not just uncomfortable, it could kill you. The bone needles were carved from the hollow leg bones of cranes and other large birds, shaped to points, finer than any metal needle but strong enough to penetrate multiple layers of tough buffalo hide. The women maintained collections of needles in different sizes, keeping them in decorated cases made from porcupine, quills, and soft leather. A broken needle during a crucial sewing project could delay completion of a tipi cover for days, while a replacement was prepared. The sense thread itself required extensive preparation. The long back tendons from adult buffalo were stripped from the carcasses immediately after butchering, cleaned of all meat and fat, and then dried in the sun until they became hard and brittle. When needed for sewing, sections of tendon were soaked in water until they became pliable, then carefully split into strands of the desired thickness. Good sign thread was incredibly strong, and when wet would shrink as it dried, pulling seams tight and making them virtually waterproof. But the tipi cover itself was only the beginning of the winter shelter system, as Buffalo Bird Woman described. The real secret lay in the inner lining, a second wall that hung inside the lodge, creating an airspace that acted as insulation. This lining, called an OAN, was made from lighter hides or woven materials. Suspended from the lodge poles about 6 ft from the ground, it forced the cold air entering at the bottom of the tipi to flow up between the outer cover and inner lining, creating a draft that carried smoke out while keeping the living space warm. The orange system represented one of the most sophisticated examples of passive climate control ever developed. The double wall construction created a thermal barrier that was far more effective than single layer shelters. Cold air, entering through the inevitable gaps at ground level, was channeled upward through the insulation space, warming as it rose and helping to draw smoke from the central fire up and out through the smoke hole at the top of the tipi. The linings themselves were often beautifully decorated, painted with family symbols and personal medicine designs. Since they faced inward toward the living space, they served as both functional insulation and artistic expression. Women would spend winter evenings working on elaborate designs that told stories, marked important events, or simply brought beauty into the utilitarian space of winter survival. My grandmother taught me to adjust this lining every day. Buffalo Bird Woman explained, too tight against the outer wall and you lost the airspace that kept you warm, too loose, and the cold air would spill into the lodge instead of flowing up and out. You had to read the wind, the temperature, the way the fire was burning, and adjust everything perfectly. This daily adjustment of the omen was part of the morning routine in every well-managed tipi. The woman of the lodge would rise before dawn, rebuild the fire from the banked coals, and then fine-tune the ventilation system based on the weather conditions. On freezing days, the lining might be lowered to retain more heat. On windy days, it might be raised to improve the draft that carried smoke away. The adjustments required an understanding of aerodynamics that the women had developed through years of practical experience. She remembered a particular night during that winter with her Lakota relatives, a night when the temperature dropped so low that their water containers froze solid despite being kept near the fire. The wind howled across the prairie with a sound like screaming, and the teepee poles creaked and swayed like ship masts in a storm. That night she watched her adopted grandmother, a lot of woman named Singing Crow, perform the intricate dance of winter survival. First, Singing Crow banked the fire with a mixture of buffalo chips and cottonwood coal. The chips burned slowly and steadily, while the coal provided intense heat. She arranged the fuel in a spiral pattern that would burn from the outside in lasting until dawn without attention. Singing Crow was a master of fire management, a skill that meant the difference between comfort and misery during the long winter nights. She had learned to read the color and behavior of flames, to judge how long different types of fuel would burn, to balance heat output against smoke production. Her fire building was an art form that combined practical knowledge with an almost mystical understanding of combustion. The buffalo chips she used were not random droppings, but carefully selected fuel that had been gathered during the summer months and stored in Parflesh waterproof storage containers. Made from rawhide, the best chips came from bulls during the rutting season when their diet was richest, creating fuel that burned hot and clean with minimal smoke. These were mixed with chips from cows and younger animals to create a fuel blend that provided steady, long-lasting heat. The cottonwood coal was made by burning cottonwood logs in a controlled manner that drove off the moisture and volatile compounds, leaving behind chunks of nearly pure carbon that burned with intense, smokeless heat. This coal was precious, requiring hours of careful tending to produce, but a handful could provide warmth through the coldest night. Then she adjusted the smoke flaps at the top of the teepee, closing them partially to retain more heat, while still allowing enough draft to prevent suffocation. The flaps were controlled by two poles that extended from the smoke ears down to ground level, allowing adjustments from inside the warm lodge. The smoke flap system was one of the most ingenious aspects of teepee design. The two flaps at the top of the lodge could be positioned to work with the prevailing wind, creating a venturi effect that drew smoke from the fire up and out of the living space. In calm weather, both flaps might be opened equally. In windy conditions, one flap would be closed, and the other positioned to catch the breeze. The poles that controlled the flaps were carefully balanced, allowing even a child to make adjustments from inside the warm lodge. Around the fire Singing Crow placed stones that had been heating in the flames all day. These would radiate warmth for hours after the fire died down. Some were smooth, river rocks that held heat well. Others were pieces of sandstone that heated quickly and could be wrapped in hide and placed directly against the bodies of the very young or very old. The use of heated stones as thermal batteries was a sophisticated heat management technique. Different types of stones had different thermal properties. River rocks held heat for long periods, but took time to warm up, while sandstone and granite heated quickly, but released their heat faster. Experienced women maintained collections of stones specifically chosen for their heating properties, keeping them near the fire ring for immediate use when temperatures dropped. Some stones were small enough to be wrapped in soft hide and used as personal heating devices, tucked into bedding or held against the body. Others were large enough to heat significant portions of the lodge floor, creating warm zones where people could sit or lie even when the fire burned low. The placement of these stones was strategic, creating patterns of warmth that maximized comfort while conserving fuel. That night, Buffalo Bird Woman recalled, "I learned that staying warm was not about enduring the cold, it was about understanding heat. where it came from, how it moved, how to capture it and hold it and use it wisely. This lesson went far beyond the simple mechanics of fire building. Buffalo Woman learned to think of heat as a resource that could be harvested, stored, and distributed. She learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated heat loss, the feel of cold air currents, the behavior of smoke, the way frost formed on different surfaces, inside the lodge. Most importantly, she learned that warmth was not something that happened to you, but something you created through knowledge, planning, and constant attention to detail. The sleeping arrangements that night were a carefully orchestrated system of shared warmth. The lodge held 14 people, 3 families related by marriage and kinship. The adults slept in pairs, their buffalo robes overlapping to create sealed envelopes of body heat. Children slept between adults or in groups of 3 or 4, their smaller bodies generating less heat individually but staying warm through proximity. The sleeping arrangements were not random but followed complex, social and practical protocols. Honored elders slept in the warmest spots, closest to the fire but protected from sparks by carefully placed stones and hides. Young families with infants were positioned where they could tend the fire during the night without disturbing others. Single men often slept near the entrance, where they could respond quickly to any threats, while single women were placed in the protected areas toward the back of the lodge. The buffalo robes, used for bedding, were works of art as well as functional items. Winter robes came from buffalo killed during the coldest months, when their fur was thickest and most insulating. The robes were prepared with the hair left on, creating natural sleeping bags that could maintain body heat even in sub-zero temperatures. The largest robes, taken from mature bulls, could easily accommodate 4 or 5 people and were often family heirlooms passed down through generations. Buffalo Bird Woman slept between 2 older girls, all 3 wrapped in a single enormous robe made from a bull buffalo's winter coat. The hide still smelled faintly of sage smoke and tanning solution, but it was warm and dry and large enough that they could pull it completely over their heads when the cold was most intense. We slept like puppies, she remembered with a soft laugh, all pressed together, sharing breath and warmth. In the morning there would be frost on the inside walls of the tipi, but under the robes we were as warm as if we had slept in. Summer. The shared sleeping arrangements created bonds that went beyond mere survival necessity. Children learned to sleep quietly and still, understanding that excessive movement could let cold air into the warm envelopes created by the robes. They learned to coordinate their breathing, to share warmth without stealing it, to wake without disturbing others. These lessons in cooperation and consideration served them throughout their lives, creating the social skills necessary for successful communal living. But warmth alone was not enough for survival. Food, especially in winter, required constant attention and careful management. Buffalo Bird Woman learned to prepare meals that would provide maximum heat and energy while using minimum fuel. Stews that cooked slowly all day, their steam adding humidity to the dry air, while their warmth provided internal heating for anyone who ate them. Winter cooking was a complex art that balanced nutrition, fuel efficiency, and morale. The long dark months required foods that would maintain body heat from the inside, provide the extra calories needed to fuel the metabolic furnaces that kept people alive in sub-zero temperatures, and offer enough variety to prevent the depression and apathy that could be as dangerous as cold itself. The slow-cooking stews that simmered all day served multiple functions. They made efficient use of fuel by cooking at low temperatures for extended periods. They provided constant humidity that prevented the respiratory problems caused by breathing extremely dry winter air, and they filled the lodge with appetizing aromas that helped maintain morale during the most difficult months. The steam from these stews also helped to keep the inner lining, of the tipi from becoming too dry and brittle. She learned to make pecan, dried buffalo meat pounded with fat and berries, into a concentrated food that could be eaten cold if necessary, but was better when crumbled into hot water to make a kind of soup. She learned to prepare marrow bones by roasting them in the coals, then cracking them to extract the rich fat that would fuel a human body through the coldest nights. Penman was the ultimate survival food, containing all the nutrients necessary to sustain life in the harshest conditions. The preparation process began in summer, when berries were ripe and fresh meat was plentiful. Thin strips of buffalo meat were dried on wooden racks until they became hard and brittle, then pounded into powder using stone moss and sidelined pits. This meat powder was mixed with rendered fat, dried berries, and sometimes crushed nuts or roots, then formed into compact blocks that would keep for years without spoiling. The marrow bones were considered one of the greatest delicacies and most important survival foods. The rich, fatty marrow provided concentrated calories and essential nutrients that kept the human body functioning in freezing. The bones were carefully selected from the largest buffalo split with stone hammers to reveal the creamy marrow inside, then either eaten raw or lightly roasted to bring out the nutty flavor. Food was medicine. In winter, she explained, certain plants kept your blood warm, certain fats kept your skin from cracking, certain broths kept the cough from settling in your chest. My grandmother knew them all, and she taught me to recognize them, even when they were dried and stored, even when they had been ground into powder. The medicinal aspect of winter nutrition was based on centuries of accumulated knowledge about which foods provided what kinds of protection against cold weather, ailments. Rose hips gathered in late fall and dried for winter use provided vitamin C that prevented scurvy wild. Onions and garlic stored in underground caches had antibacterial properties that helped prevent respiratory infections. Various roots and barks were prepared as teas that stimulated circulation and helped the body generate internal heat. One of Buffalo Woman's most vivid memories was of a blizzard that lasted for 5 days. The wind piled snow against the teepee until the lower portion was completely buried, creating additional insulation but also trapping the occupants inside. For 5 days, no one could leave the lodge except to gather snow for water and to answer the calls of nature. That 5-day blizzard was the kind of storm that tested every aspect of winter survival preparation. Snow accumulated so quickly that it had to be cleared from the smoke hole every few hours to prevent suffocation. The wind was so fierce that opening the entrance flap, even briefly, sent clouds of snow swirling through the lodge instantly, lowering the temperature and soaking anyone nearby. During such storms, the top became a complete life support system. Everything needed for survival had to be contained within the lodge or immediately accessible outside. Fuel had to be rationed carefully to last through the entire storm. Food had to be prepared in ways that minimized the need to venture outside. Water had to be obtained by melting snow, which required additional fuel and careful management to avoid flooding the lodge floor. During those 5 days, the people inside the teepee lived on, stored food and shared stories, songs, and the kind of intimate knowledge that only comes from being pressed together by necessity. Buffalo Bird Woman learned genealogies going back 7 generations, learned the stories attached to every design on every piece of clothing, learned the prayers that were said for different kinds of weather. The enforced confinement of blizzard days was transformed into opportunities for cultural transmission that might otherwise have been neglected during busier times. With no hunting, no traveling, no outside work possible, the lodge became a classroom where the deepest knowledge of the people was shared. Elders told stories that explained the origins of important customs, the meanings of sacred designs, the relationships between families and clans. Children learned not just the facts of their heritage, but the emotional and spiritual dimensions of their culture. They learned which stories could only be told in winter, which songs were appropriate for different occasions, which designs carried spiritual power and which were merely decorative. They learned the subtle differences in dialect that identified a speaker's tribal affiliation, the hand signs that allowed communication across language barriers, the complex protocols that governed interactions between different social groups. That storm taught me that winter was not just about staying warm, she reflected. It was about staying human. The cold could freeze your body, but the darkness and the isolation could freeze your spirit. The tipi had to be a place where people could live, not just survive. This insight spoke to one of the most crucial aspects of successful winter survival. In traditional cultures, physical warmth was only part of the equation. Mental and spiritual health were equally important for making it through the long months of cold and darkness. The tipi had to function as more than shelter. It had to be a space where human relationships could flourish, where culture could be maintained, where hope could be sustained through the most difficult times. When the storm finally passed, the emerged world was transformed. Snow had drifted 20 feet high in some places, and the landscape looked completely foreign. But the tipi had held, the fire had burned, the people had survived, and life continued. The bottom emergence was always a moment of celebration and renewal. After days of confinement, people emerged to find a world remade by wind and snow. The familiar landmarks were buried or transformed, creating a landscape that seemed alien yet beautiful. The work of digging out began immediately, clearing paths between lodges, locating cached supplies that had been buried, checking on the horses and other animals that had weathered the storm in their own shelters. Buffalo Bird Woman lived through 68 more winters after that storm, each one teaching her new subtleties about the balance between warmth and survival. She saw the great changes that came to the plains, the disappearance of the buffalo, the coming of the reservations, the gradual abandonment of the old ways of living. Those 68 winters spanned one of the most dramatic periods of change in human history. Buffalo Bird Woman watched the ancient rhythms of nomadic life give way to the constraints of reservation boundaries. She saw the great herds reduced to scattered remnants, then to nothing at all. She witnessed the arrival of railroads, the establishment of military forts, the coming of missionaries and government schools that tried to erase everything she had learned as a child. Yet through all these changes, she continued to refine her understanding of traditional survival skills. Even as the opportunities to practice them diminished, she retained the knowledge, adapting it to new circumstances. When buffalo became scarce, she learned to work with cattle hides. When traditional materials became unavailable, she experimented with substitutes. The underlying principles remained constant, even as the specific techniques evolved. In her final years, when she sat with the men who wrote down her stories, she spoke with the authority of someone who had lived through the transition between worlds. She had slept, warm in tipi when the buffalo were endless and the prairie was unmarked by roads. She had also slept in government-built houses with wood stoves and glass windows. The contrast between the old ways and the new was stark in her experience. The government houses were certainly easier to heat, requiring less daily attention and physical labor, but they were also more dependent on external resources, manufactured stoves, cut lumber, coal or wood that had to be purchased or hauled from distant sources. When these resources were unavailable, the houses became cold, uncomfortable shelters that provided little protection from severe weather. The TPS, by contrast, were completely self-contained systems that could be maintained with materials available from the immediate environment. They required more knowledge and skill to manage effectively, but once that knowledge was mastered, they provided reliable comfort under the most extreme conditions. They were also portable, allowing families to move with the seasons and the availability of resources. The old way, she said, required more work, more knowledge, more cooperation between people. But it was not harder living. It was different living. We knew exactly how to be comfortable with what we had, exactly how to find warmth in the coldest places, exactly how to make a home that could move with the seasons and the animals we followed. This distinction between harder and different was crucial to her understanding of the changes she had witnessed. The traditional lifestyle required different skills and different ways of thinking about comfort and security, but it was not inherently more difficult or less satisfying than modern alternatives. In many ways, it provided greater security because it was based on knowledge and skills that could be applied anywhere, using resources that were locally available rather than dependent on distant supply chains. Her voice, preserved in field recordings made when she was nearly 80 years old, still carries the cadence of the plains wind, still holds the patience of someone who learned to read weather in the movement of grass, who could judge the quality of firewood by its smell, who knew the exact moment when the day's heat was fading, and it was time to begin preparing for another night of careful warmth management. Those recordings made on primitive equipment in the early decades of the 20th century capture not just her words, but something of the world she had lived in, her speech. Patterns reflect the rhythms of nomadic life, the careful observation of natural phenomena, the deep integration of practical knowledge with spiritual understanding. Even filtered through the mechanical limitations of early recording technology, her voice carries the authority of lived experience and the sadness of knowledge that was disappearing. People think we were always cold, she concluded, but that is not true. We were warm when we needed to be warm. We were comfortable when we needed to be comfortable. Furthermore, we knew how to live with winter instead of hiding from it. As her story settles into the quiet spaces of memory, we can almost see her as she was in that long-ago winter, a young girl learning the skills that would keep her people alive, her hands growing strong from the endless work of preparation, her mind absorbing the intricate knowledge that turned animal hides and wooden poles into homes that could shelter families through the harshest seasons the planet could offer. Outside her memory, the same wind still blows across the same prairie, but now it finds different shelters, different fires, different dreams of warmth. Yet somewhere in the pattern of her words, in the rhythm of her recollections, the old knowledge persists. The understanding that comfort is not a given, that warmth must be earned, that survival requires not just courage but wisdom, passed carefully from one generation to the next. Like the most precious gift imaginable, the knowledge buffalo, Birdwoman shared represents more than historical curiosity. It embodies a way of understanding the relationship between humans and their environment that goes far deeper than simple survival. Technique. Her tipi was not just a shelter, but a philosophy made manifest, a demonstration that human beings could live comfortably and sustainably in the harshest environments by working with natural forces rather than against them. In our current age of climate-controlled buildings and global supply chains, her insights offer a different perspective on what it means to be at home in the world. She understood that true security comes not from insulation against natural forces, but from deep knowledge of how to work with them. Her warmth was not purchased but created, not supplied but earned through understanding, skill and constant attention to the subtle relationships between fire, air, shelter and the human bodies that needed protection from the cold. Her legacy lives on, not in the physical structures she helped to build, which have long since returned to the earth, but in the knowledge she chose to share. The understanding that human beings are capable of extraordinary adaptation, that comfort can be created from the simplest materials, that survival is ultimately an art form that combines practical skill with wisdom, patience, and respect for the forces that shape our world. As Buffalo Bird Woman's voice fades into the gentle rustle of memory, let us drift deeper into the puzzle that has intrigued archaeologists and anthropologists for generations. How did structures so seemingly simple create microclimates so perfectly suited to human survival? Picture yourself as an archaeologist, kneeling in the prairie grass of Montana on a summer morning in 1923. The sun is warm on your back, but beneath your hands, the soil tells stories of winter nights so cold they seem impossible to survive. Here, scattered across a gentle rise above a creek, you find the evidence of a winter camp. Circles of stones that once held down, tipi covers, fire, blackened, earth where families gathered for warmth, and fragments of a puzzle that modern science is only beginning to understand. The morning dew clings to the buffalo grass around you, each blade holding tiny prisms that catch and scatter the early light. Your tail scrapes gently against something hard. Another stone worn smooth by countless seasons of wind and weather. But this one is different. Unlike the angular field stones scattered naturally across the prairie, this rock bears the unmistakable signs of human selection, the perfect ovoid shape that fits comfortably in cupped hands. The density that speaks of hours spent absorbing and radiating heat, the subtle scorch marks that whisper of flames and family, gatherings lost to time. Dr. James Willard Schultz, the ethnographer working beside you, points to a ring of stones, 40 ft in circumference. Large family lodge, he murmurs, his voice carrying the reverence of someone who has slept in such structures. Probably housed 12 to 15 people through the winter of 1868, maybe 1869. His weathered fingers trace the arc of stones with the familiarity of someone reading a familiar text. Each placement tells a story. The larger stones positioned to catch and hold the most heat, the smaller ones arranged to create precise gaps that controlled airflow, like the stops of a massive organ. But as you brush soil away from the central fire pit, questions multiply like shadows in the evening light. The fire ring is surprisingly small, barely 3 ft across. How could such a modest blaze warm a space large enough for 15 people when the outside temperature dropped to 30 below zero? The mathematics seem impossible, the physics defiant of everything. You thought you knew about heat and shelter. Your modern understanding suggests that a fire this size should be adequate for perhaps 3 or 4 people in mild weather. Yet historical accounts describe large families living in comfort around such fires through Montana winters that killed cattle by the thousands and froze rivers, solid for months. The discrepancy haunts you as you measure and photograph each notation in your field journal, an admission of how much remains unknown about the technologies that sustained human life on the northern plains for millennia. This is the mystery that has haunted researchers for decades. The tipi heating system that works so efficiently that families survived in comfort through conditions that would kill. Modern campers in hours, yet left almost no trace for archaeologists to study. The organic materials, the hides, the wooden poles, the intricate linings and windscreens have long since returned to Earth, leaving only stones and fire, stained soil, and the persistent questions of how it all worked together. The archaeological record teases with its fragments. Here, a concentration of charcoal that suggests a fire burned not for hours but for days, tended with such skill that it never blazed high enough to waste fuel or died low enough to lose its warmth. There, a pattern of discoloration in the soil that might indicate where buffalo robes were arranged or where heated stones were buried to warm sleeping areas. Each clue is tantalizing but incomplete, like trying to reconstruct a symphony from scattered notes found on a theatre floor. The first clue lies in the placement of these ancient camps. Every site archaeologists have studied shows the same careful attention to microtopography. The tipis were never placed randomly across the landscape, but were positioned with scientific precision to take advantage of every possible source of natural warmth and protection. Winter camps cluster in river valleys where the land provides windbreaks and where cottonwood trees offer fuel, but more specifically, they occupy the south-facing slopes just above the floodplain, high enough to avoid the coldest air that settles in low places, but low enough to be sheltered from the constant prairie winds. The precision of this placement becomes apparent only when you understand the thermal geography of winter landscapes, the way cold air behaves like a slow-moving liquid, pooling in, depressions and flowing down watercourses in currents invisible to the untrained eye. Dr. Sarah Winnetka, a put consultant working with early anthropological expeditions, explained the logic with the clarity of inherited wisdom. Cold air flows like water. It runs downhill and pools in the bottoms. Warm air rises and gets blown away by wind. The perfect place for a winter lodge is where you can catch the warm air before it escapes, but avoid the cold air that wants to settle. Her words carry the accumulated observations of countless generations who lived or died by their understanding of these invisible rivers of temperature that flow across the landscape every winter night. This understanding of thermal dynamics was so sophisticated that it rivals modern meteorological science. Plains peoples had identified and learned to exploit the temperature inversions that occur in mountain valleys, the wind chill effects of different topographies, the subtle variations in ground temperature that could mean the difference between a comfortable night and a deadly one. They understood that a site protected from the north wind might still be treacherous if it lay in a hollow where cold air collected, that a hillside facing the morning sun could be 10 degrees warmer than a seemingly identical slope facing the afternoon light. Modern weather stations and thermal imaging confirm what indigenous knowledge keepers knew intuitively. The microclimates within a single valley can vary by 20 degrees or more on a still winter night. The difference between survival and death often lay not in having better shelter or more fuel, but in understanding these invisible thermal territories well enough to position a dwelling in exactly the right spot to capture warmth and deflect cold. But placement was only the beginning of the mystery. Archaeological evidence suggests that tipi heating involved technologies and techniques that seem to have been deliberately hidden from European observers, or perhaps were so commonplace that they seemed unremarkable to the people who used them daily. The secrecy may have been intentional, born from hard experience with visitors who observed without understanding, who saw surface practices without grasping the deep knowledge that made them effective. Too often, European accounts describe what appeared to be simple fires and basic shelters, missing entirely the sophisticated systems that lay beneath the apparent simplicity. The observers lacked the experiential framework to recognize engineering when it appeared in forms that differed from their own technological traditions. Consider the enigma of the heating stones. At dozens of winter campsites, archaeologists have found caches of smooth river rocks buried in and around former fire pits. These stones show clear evidence of repeated heating stress, fractures from thermal expansion, scorch marks from direct contact with flames, sometimes even residual traces of animal fat that was used to prevent them from cracking. The stones range in size, from hen's eggs to human heads, and they're always rocks with specific thermal properties. Sandstone that heats quickly, quartzite that holds heat for hours, granite that provides steady, even warmth. The selection wasn't random. Someone had tested these materials, learned their characteristics, chosen them with the care of an engineer selecting components for a complex system. Each type of stone served a specific purpose in the heating system. The sandstone, with its relatively low density and high porosity, could be heated quickly to provide immediate warmth when the evening fire was lit. The quartzite, dense and crystalline, absorbed heat more slowly but retained it through the long winter night, becoming the thermal backbone of the sleeping area. The granite, with its even texture and stable composition, provided steady, predictable heat that could be counted on not to crack or explode when subjected to the thermal stress of repeated heating and cooling cycles. But how were they used? Buffalo Bird Woman's testimony provides hints. The grandmother stones slept with us in the coldest months. Other accounts speak of rocks heated in the fire, wrapped in hides and placed against the bodies of infants and elders. Some describe stones arranged around the sleeping area to create zones of radiant heat that lasted through the night. The technique required extraordinary skill and knowledge. Stones heated too quickly could shatter explosively, sending dangerous fragments flying through the confined space of the tipi. Stones that were too hot could burn through the buffalo hides used to wrap them, or, worse, could burn the people they were meant to warm. The temperature had to be judged by eye and touch, by the sound the stone made when water droplets were flicked onto its surface, by the way it looked in the firelight. A deep red that spoke of perfect heating, not the bright orange that warned of dangerous overheating. The wrapping of heated stones was itself an art that combined material science with practical medicine. Different hides provided different insulation properties. Thick buffalo hide for stones that would be placed near children. Thinner deer hide for stones that adults could tolerate at higher temperatures. The fat used to treat the wrapping. Materials had to be carefully selected. 2. Bear fat stayed pliable in freezing buffalo. Tallow provided steady insulation, while certain plant oils prevented the hide from becoming brittle and cracking. Yet the archaeological evidence suggests something even more sophisticated. At several sites, researchers have found carefully constructed stone chambers buried beneath what were once tipi floors. Stone-lined pits filled with rocks and connected to the central fire pit by channels that seemed designed to conduct heat. Underground, these installations, if that's what they were, would have created a system of radiant floor heating that could warm the sleeping area for hours. After the surface fire burned down to coals, the heated stones would warm the earth itself, turning the ground into a massive thermal battery that released heat slowly throughout the night. The engineering principles involved are remarkably sophisticated. The stone-lined channels would have created convection currents that drew heated air from the fire pit down into the underground chambers, where it would heat the stored rocks before rising back to the surface. The system would have operated on the same principles used in Roman hippos and modern geothermal heating, but adapted to the mobile lifestyle of plain peoples and constructed entirely from materials available in the natural environment. The placement and design of these underground heating systems required deep understanding of soil conditions, drainage patterns, and thermal properties. The chambers had to be positioned where they wouldn't flood during spring, lined with stones that wouldn't shift or settle under the weight of people sleeping above, connected to the main fire pit by channels that would draw efficiently without creating dangerous downdrafts or carbon monoxide accumulation. Dr. Francis Kenmore, who recorded hundreds of hours of interviews with elderly Plains Indians in the 1920s and 1930s, heard references to these systems but was never able to see one in operation. The old men would speak of warming the earth, mother's bones, she wrote. But when I asked for details, they would only smile and say that such knowledge was not for writing down. This secrecy, or perhaps simply the intimate nature of survival knowledge, has left modern researchers with tantalizing fragments of a heating technology that may have been far more sophisticated than anyone realized. The thermal efficiency required to keep people alive in such extreme conditions suggests engineering principles that mainstream archaeology is only beginning to acknowledge. The reluctance to share detailed technical knowledge may have stemmed from spiritual beliefs about the relationship between humans and the natural world, but it also reflected practical concerns about the misuse of powerful technologies. Heating systems required not just technical skill but deep respect for fire as a living force that could provide life or deal death, depending on how it was approached. Knowledge holders may have recognized that techniques demonstrated casually to casual observers could be dangerous in inexperienced hands. Recent experimental archaeology has attempted to recreate these systems. Research teams in Montana and Wyoming have built authentic hippies using traditional materials and techniques, then tested their thermal performance during actual winter conditions. The results have been both illuminating and puzzling. Even without the hypothetical underground heating chambers, a properly constructed tipi with traditional lining systems maintains internal temperatures 20 to 30 degrees warmer than outside. Conditions: the console shape creates natural convection currents that draw smoke up and out while circulating. Warm air throughout the living space. The double wall construction provides insulation equivalent to a modern sleeping bag. The experiments revealed the elegant physics built into the tipi design. The smoke flaps at the top of the structure could be adjusted to create precise air circulation patterns, drawing fresh air in at the bottom while venting smoke and stale air at the top. The angle of the walls created convection currents that circulated warm air in predictable patterns, ensuring that heat from the central fire reached every part of the living space. The lining systems proved particularly ingenious. The traditional dew cloth, a hide lining hung around the interior walls about 6 feet from the ground, created a dead airspace that provided crucial insulation while also directing airflow in ways that maximized comfort and minimized heat loss. The gap between the lining and the outer wall allowed cold air to be drawn up and out of the structure, while the warm air in the living space remained largely undisturbed. But the numbers still don't fully explain the comfort levels described in historical accounts. Too many variables remain unknown: the exact techniques for fire management, the specific ways that heated stones were integrated into the heating system, the precise methods for adjusting ventilation to optimize heat retention while preventing carbon monoxide poisoning. The fire management techniques in particular appear to have involved skills that modern people have largely lost. Historical accounts describe fires that burned steadily through the night without consuming excessive fuel, that could be banked to provide gentle heat for hours, that produced minimal smoke while maximizing thermal output. These achievements required understanding of combustion chemistry, fuel properties, and air circulation that went far beyond simply lighting wood and keeping it burning. Different types of fuel required different handling techniques. Buffalo chips, the primary fuel on the treeless plains, burned at specific temperatures and produced characteristic types of heat depending on factors that fire tenders learned to recognize and exploit. Fresh chips burned hot and fast, suitable for cooking and quick warming. Aged chips burned longer and more evenly, perfect for overnight heating. Chips from grass-fed buffalo burned differently than those from animals that had been eating sage or other plants, and experienced firekeepers could judge the heating properties of fuel by examining it before it was ever lit. Wood, when available, presented its own complexities. Green cottonwood produced steady, smoky heat that was perfect for overnight fires, but poor for cooking. Seasoned ash burned hot and clean, but required careful management to avoid overheating the living space. Dead oak, when it could be found, provided the perfect balance of heat output and burn duration, but it required techniques for banking and air control that took years to master. Perhaps the deepest mystery lies in the cultural knowledge that surrounded these heating systems. Every aspect of tipi living involved skills and understanding that took years to master. The women who managed these winter homes were, in effect, environmental engineers who understood thermodynamics, air circulation, fuel combustion, and thermal mass storage. They knew that buffalo chips burned at different temperatures depending on the animal's diet and the season when the dung was deposited. They could judge the heating capacity of a piece of wood by its species, its moisture content, and the sound it made when struck. Furthermore, they understood that different types of fires, fast, hot flames versus slow, steady coals, had different roles in maintaining comfort through a winter night. The depth of this knowledge extended to subtleties that modern science is only beginning to appreciate. Firekeepers understood that the humidity of combustion air affected burn rates and heat output. They knew that atmospheric pressure changes, preceding weather fronts, would alter the way their fires burned and could adjust their fire management. Accordingly, they recognized that winds from different directions required different ventilation strategies to maintain proper air circulation within the tipi. The seasonal variations in fuel properties required corresponding adjustments in fire building techniques. Summer, buffalo chips dried quickly in hot sun burned differently than autumn chips that had cured slowly through cool nights. Spring wood full of rising sap produced different heat characteristics than fall wood harvested after the growing season ended. Master firekeepers maintained mental catalogues of these variations and adapted their techniques accordingly. This knowledge was embedded in daily routines that seemed simple but were actually highly sophisticated. The morning fire was built differently than the evening fire. The fuel used during storms was different from what was burned on clear nights. The arrangement of sleeping robes, the positioning of personal belongings, even the way people sat and moved within the lodge. All of these were choreographed to support the thermal management system. The morning fire routine began before dawn, when the overnight fire had burned down to coals, but the thermal mass of heated stones and warm earth still held enough energy to make rekindling comfortable rather than desperate. The firekeeper would rise in the darkness, feeling the temperature gradients within the tipi to judge how much heat remained in the system, then build the morning fire with precisely the right amount of fuel to warm the space for the day's activities without wasting energy or creating uncomfortable overheating as the sun rose. Evening fires required different strategies entirely. As outside temperatures began to drop, with the setting sun, the firekeeper would begin building thermal mass for the night, heating stones that would be placed in sleeping areas, warming the earth around the fire pit, creating the conditions that would maintain comfort through the long winter night. The evening fire burned hotter and longer than the morning fire, but it was managed with an eye toward the transition to overnight heating, when flame would give way to coals and radiant heat from warmed materials would carry families through to dawn. Storm fires presented the greatest challenge and required the most sophisticated techniques. When blizzards raged across the plains, the normal ventilation patterns of the tipi were disrupted by rapidly changing wind directions and extreme temperature differentials. Firekeepers had to maintain warmth and air quality while adapting to conditions that could shift from hour to hour. They knew how to create burns that would resist being blown out by sudden gusts, how to adjust ventilation to prevent downdrafts that could fill the living space. With smoke, how to maintain steady heat output when normal fuel supplies might be cut off by the storm. Consider the mystery of the inner sanctum, the space directly around the fire pit that served as the thermal heart of the tipi. Archaeological evidence suggests this area was often lined with specially selected materials, certain clays that held and radiated heat, specific types of sand that could be heated and rad to warm sleeping areas, even arrangements of flat stones that created heated surfaces for food preparation and body warming. The selection and preparation of these materials required knowledge that spanned geology, chemistry, and physics. The clays had to be types that would expand and contract with heating and cooling cycles without cracking, that would absorb and release heat at rates that complemented the overall thermal management system. Some clays were mixed with organic materials, dried grass or animal hair that prevented cracking, while adding insulation properties. The sands used in fire areas were chosen for their thermal properties and their stability under repeated heating. River sands with specific mineral compositions heated evenly and retained warmth for hours after fires burned down. Volcanic sands, where available, provided superior heat retention, but required different handling techniques. Some sands were mixed with powdered charcoal or other materials that enhanced their thermal performance. The flat stones arranged around fire areas served multiple functions in the heating system. They absorbed heat during active burning, then radiated that heat for hours afterward. They provided clean, warm surfaces for food preparation, allowing cooking to continue long after flames died down. They could be heated and then moved to sleeping areas, carrying concentrated thermal energy to where it was most needed during the coldest parts of the night. Some accounts describe elaborate windscreens and baffles constructed inside the type to direct airflow in precise patterns. These internal structures made from hides and wooden frames could be adjusted to channel cold air away from sleeping areas, while directing heated air to where it was most needed. The tipi became not just a shelter, but a sophisticated climate control system managed by people who understood its operation intuitively. The windscreens served as more than simple barriers to drafts. They created pressure differentials that enhanced the natural convection currents within the tipi, channeling warm air in specific directions while preventing cold air from pooling in sleeping areas. The screens could be adjusted throughout the day as wind directions changed and as the heating needs of the occupants shifted with their activities and the outside temperature. The internal baffles worked in concert with the tipi's natural aerodynamics to create microclimates within the single living space. Areas near the fire could be kept warmer for activities that required heat, food preparation, tool making, social gathering. Sleeping areas could be maintained at different temperatures suitable for different family members, with warmer zones for infants and elders, cooler areas for active adults. The mystery deepens when you consider the seasonal variations in these systems. Summer tipis were constructed and managed differently than winter lodges, but the transition between configurations was seamless. The same physical structure could be modified through changes in lining, ventilation, fire management, and internal arrangement to provide comfort across a temperature range of more than 100 degrees. This adaptability suggests a level of environmental engineering that challenges modern assumptions about primitive technology. The tipi heating system was simultaneously simple enough to be operated by children and sophisticated enough to maintain human life in conditions that would defeat most contemporary heating systems. The summer configuration emphasized cooling and ventilation. The tipi could be opened at the bottom to create natural air conditioning as wind flowed under the walls and up through the smoke hole. The lining systems that provided insulation in winter could be removed or reconfigured to encourage air circulation. Fire management shifted from heat production to cooking and lighting, with techniques optimized for minimal heat output rather than maximum warmth. The transition between seasons required not just physical modifications, but changes in daily routines, fire management practices, and social arrangements within the lodge. Spring setup involved testing and repairing heating systems that had been dormant through the warm months. Fall preparation required gathering and preparing heating materials, checking stone caches for cracking or deterioration, ensuring that all the components of the winter heating system were ready for the long months of cold. Yet perhaps the greatest mystery is how this knowledge was preserved and transmitted across generations without written records, technical manuals, or formal instruction. Young people learned by observation, by gradual participation, by the accumulation of small experiences that built into comprehensive understanding. A grandmother teaching her granddaughter to bank a fire was also transmitting principles of combustion chemistry. A father showing his son how to position stones was also teaching thermal dynamics. The knowledge lived in hands and intuition in the ability to read subtle signs and respond appropriately. It was embodied wisdom that connected human survival to deep understanding of natural processes, the kind of knowledge that modern science respects but struggles to quantify or preserve. Children began learning the basics of fire and heat management as soon as they could safely approach the fire pit. They learned by watching, by being allowed to help with simple tasks, by gradually taking on more responsibility as their understanding deepened. A 5-year-old might help gather fuel, learning to distinguish between different types of materials and their burning properties. A 10-year-old might be trusted to tend a fire for short periods, learning the subtle signs that indicated whether a fire needed more fuel or more air. The teaching was embedded in daily life rather than formalized into lessons. Every meal preparation was an opportunity to learn about heat control. Every evening, firebanking was a demonstration of thermal management principles. Every morning, rekindling was a chance to understand the relationship between combustion and air circulation. The knowledge accumulated gradually, naturally, as part of growing up in a culture where understanding these systems was essential for survival. By adolescence, young people were expected to understand the basic principles well enough to help manage the heating systems under supervision. They learned to read weather signs that indicated when heating strategies would need to change, to recognize fuel that would burn well and avoid materials that would produce dangerous smoke or insufficient heat. They began to understand the social aspects of fire management, how different family members had different heating needs, how the fire served as the center of social life, as well as the source of physical warmth. Master firekeepers, usually women who had decades of experience managing these systems, possessed knowledge that went far beyond simple technique. They understood the relationship between weather patterns and heating requirements, could predict fuel needs weeks in advance, knew how to modify heating strategies for sick or elderly family members who might need special thermal care. This expertise was recognized and respected within the community, and master firekeepers often served as advisors to younger families setting up their own households. The knowledge also included understanding of the spiritual dimensions of fire and heat. Fire was seen as a living force that required respect and proper treatment. The heating systems were not merely mechanical arrangements but sacred technologies that connected human communities to the natural world. The daily tending of fires involved ritual elements that reinforced proper attitudes toward the forces that sustained life. As you kneel in that prairie grass, brushing soil away from stones that once held families warm through impossible winters, you begin to understand that you're not just uncovering artifacts. You're touching the edges of a mystery that encompasses engineering, meteorology, material science and human ingenuity refined over thousands of years. The stones remain silent and patient, holding their secrets in the spaces between what can be measured and what can only be experienced. Somewhere in their arrangement, in the patterns of fire, stained earth, in the subtle modifications of terrain that created perfect thermal conditions, lies the answer to how people stayed warm in structures that seemed too simple to work. Each stone tells part of the story. This one, smooth and rounded, speaks of careful selection from a riverbed of hands that tested its weight and density, of fires that heated it hundreds of times over the years of its service. That one, cracked but still positioned precisely within the ring, bears witness to thermal stresses that would challenge modern materials to heating and cooling cycles that spanned decades of winters. The first stained earth beneath your trowel holds its own testimony. The patterns of discoloration reveal where fires burned hot and where they smoldered gently, where heated stones were placed to warm sleeping areas, where the thermal management system concentrated its energy for maximum efficiency. Chemical analysis might reveal traces of the organic materials that enhanced the heating system. The fats used to treat heating stones, the plant materials mixed with clay linings, the charcoal that provided steady, even heat. But perhaps the real mystery is not how they did it, but how knowledge, so essential to human survival, could be so perfectly adapted to its environment that it left almost no trace for future generations to study. The teepee heating system worked so well, so efficiently, so naturally, that it seems to have disappeared into the landscape itself, leaving only whispered references in the memories of the last people who knew how to read the language of stones and fire and wind. The efficiency of the system may have been its downfall. From an archaeological perspective, technologies that work perfectly tend to leave fewer traces than technologies that fail. The heating systems that kept families alive through brutal winters did their work so well that they required no waste, no excess, no redundancy that might survive in the archaeological record. They were refined over millennia to use exactly the energy needed and no more, to heat exactly the spaces required and no others, to operate with a precision that left little evidence for future investigators. The sun sets behind you as you work, and the temperature begins to drop. In a few hours, this summer evening will become a cold prairie night, and you will retreat to your modern tent with its synthetic insulation and propane heater. But the stones beneath your hands have felt winter nights that would humble any contemporary technology, and somehow mysteriously they kept people warm. As darkness approaches and the first stars appear above the Montana prairie, you gather your tools and notes, knowing that tomorrow will bring more careful excavation, more measurements, more questions. But tonight, as you zip yourself into your sleeping bag and listen to the wind in the grass, you understand that you have spent the day in the presence of a mystery that may never be fully solved. The mystery of how human intelligence and natural forces combined to create technology so elegant and effective that they vanish into the landscape, leaving only stones and stories and the endless questions of those who come after wondering how it was done. As the mysteries of ancient heating settle like dust on forgotten stones, let us drift toward a different kind of warmth, the kind that came not just from perfectly banked fires and skillfully arranged stones, but from the subtle privileges that mark the difference between surviving winter and living through it in comfort. Picture a winter camp along the Yellowstone River. February 1856. Snow has been falling for 3 days, and the wind carries the kind of cold that makes exposed skin burn and lungs ache. Across the camp, 43 teepees cluster in the shelter of cottonwoods, their smoke holes, sending thin streams of grey into the pewter sky. But even in this seemingly egalitarian circle of lodges, warmth was not distributed equally. At the centre of the camp, slightly uphill from the others and positioned to catch the maximum sunlight, stands a teepee that is unmistakably different, 24 feet in diameter instead of the usual 12 or 15, constructed from the hides of 18 prime buffalo cows, decorated with painted designs that tell the story of victories in war and success in hunting. This is the Dot Lodge of Running Wolf, a Blackfoot chief whose influence extends across 3 allied bands and whose comfort in winter reflects not just personal success, but the complex social systems that determined who stayed warm and who merely survived. Inside Running Wolf's lodge, the differences are immediately apparent to anyone who has spent nights in the smaller, more crowded teepees of common families. The fire pit is larger, lined with carefully selected stones that hold and radiate heat more efficiently than the random rocks used in poorer lodges. The fuel supply, stacked neatly along the walls, includes not just the standard buffalo chips and cottonwood branches, but precious hardwood brought from the mountains, charcoal made from dot oak and hickory that burns longer and hotter than anything available on the prairie. The social geography of the lodge reflects the hierarchy that winter makes visible in ways that summer abundance tends to obscure. Running Wolf sits in the place of honor, directly opposite the entrance, wrapped in a robe made from the hide of a white buffalo, a garment so rare and sacred that its very presence generates psychological warmth as much as physical heat. His wife, Two Bears Woman, wears a dress decorated with elk teeth, each tooth representing a successful hunt, each hunt representing meat shared with families who might otherwise go hungry. But the most telling difference is not in the decorations or the size of the fire. It's in the number of people whose labor contributes to Running Wolf's winter comfort. In a typical family lodge, 6 to 8 people share the work of staying warm, gathering fuel, tending fires, preparing food, maintaining equipment. In the chief's lodge, those 8 people are supplemented by the contributions of dozens more. Young men from families allied to Running Wolf arrive throughout the day with gifts of firewood, having traveled miles to find the best fuel available. Women from households that owe their survival to the chief's generosity during previous hard times bring prepared foods. Pekin made with the choicest berries, marrow, fat rendered from the richest bones. Herbal teas made from plants that most families have already consumed. The warmth in Running Wolf's lodge therefore represents not just the heat generated by a well-maintained fire, but the accumulated labor of an entire community channeled towards supporting its leadership. This is not mere luxury, though luxury. It certainly is, but a complex system of social insurance that ensures the survival of knowledge, authority, and decision-making capacity through the season when death comes easiest. Consider what happens on the night when the temperature drops to 40 below zero and the wind builds to a howl that threatens to tear the lodges apart. In the common tipi, families huddled together burning their fuel supplies carefully, making every buffalo chip last as long as possible, knowing that if their fire goes out during the night, they may not wake up in the morning. But in Running Wolf's lodge, the fire burns high and steady throughout the night. Young men take turns feeding the flames, ensuring that the chief and his family never experience the bone-deep cold that penetrates lesser shelters. The warmth is not just physical, but psychological. Running Wolf sleeps soundly, knowing that his comfort is maintained by others, while those others gain the security that comes from alliance with someone whose survival is prioritized by the community. This system of differential warmth extends beyond individual lodges to encompass entire social networks around Running Wolf's central hippie. The lodges of his closest allies, his war leaders, his most successful hunters, are positioned to share in the microclimate created by the chief's larger fire and better fuel supply. These allied families burn buffalo chips that have been pre-dried in the warmth of the chief's lodge, use tools that have been sharpened and maintained by crafts. People who eat regularly because of Running Wolf's successful leadership sleep under robes that have been treated with fats and oils that lesser families cannot afford to spare. The warmth gradually diminishes as you move outward from the center of power. Families with fewer connections to the chief's network occupy tipis that are smaller, less well positioned, heated by fires that must be tended more carefully and fed more sparingly. Young men without established reputations, women without powerful relatives, elderly people whose productive years are behind them, all occupy positions in the camp's thermal hierarchy that reflect their social and economic standing. At the margins of the camp, where the wind hits hardest and the shelter is least effective, stand the lodges of those who survive on the community's sufferance. Orphaned families, people recovering from illness or injury, individuals whose bad luck or poor judgment has placed them at the mercy of others' generosity. Their fires burn low, their fuel supplies are scant, their clothing and bedding are patched and thin. Yet even this apparent inequality serves functions that pure egalitarianism might not achieve. Running Wolf's warm lodge becomes a center of winter governance, a place where decisions can be made by people who are comfortable enough to think clearly. rested enough to consider complex problems, well-fed enough to plan beyond immediate survival. When storms trap the camp for days, when food runs low, when conflicts arise between families stressed by confinement and cold, the chief's warm lodge becomes the place where solutions are developed and implemented. The psychological dynamics of winter hierarchy are as complex as the physical ones. Running Wolf's comfort is not just personal privilege but community resource. His warm, well-lit lodge serves as a gathering place for the camp's most experienced hunters, its most knowledgeable elders, its most skilled craftspeople. Winter evenings that would be spent in isolated family groups instead become opportunities for the exchange of knowledge, the planning of spring activities, the resolution of disputes that could otherwise fracture the community during its most vulnerable season. But the system creates its own tensions and contradictions. The same social networks that ensure Running Wolf's winter comfort also create obligations that extend far beyond the cold months. Families that contribute fuel and labor to the chief's warmth expect reciprocal support during summer hunts, preferential access to good camping spots, advocacy in disputes and material support if their own survival is threatened. The chief's warm lodge therefore becomes a kind of social furnace that burns through accumulated obligations as rapidly as it consumes physical fuel. Running Wolf must constantly balance the comfort his position provides against the expectations it creates. His ability to stay warm through the winter depends not just on his current resources but on his skill at managing a complex web of relationships that can provide security or create vulnerability, depending on how they are handled. Consider the arrival, during that bitter February 1856, of a messenger from a distant band seeking refuge. For his people whose winter camp was destroyed by a prairie fire that consumed their stored food and damaged their lodges, the messenger sits in Running Wolf's warm lodge, steam rising from his frost-covered clothing, eating hot stew while he explains his people's desperate situation. The decision Running Wolf makes will reflect not just personal generosity but political calculation. Accepting the refugees means sharing resources that are already stretched thin, crowding lodges that are barely adequate for their current occupants, straining fuel supplies that must last until spring. But refusing help could damage alliances that Running Wolf needs for summer. Warfare, trade relationships that bring prosperity to his people, marriage connections that bind communities together across the vast prairie. In the end, the refugees are accepted, but their integration into the winter camp creates new layers of thermal inequality. They occupy hastily constructed shelters at the very edge of the camp, places where the wind cuts most sharply and the warmth of communal fires barely reaches. They burn green wood that produces more smoke than heat, sleep under thin robes borrowed from families that can ill afford to share, eat from pots that hold more water than meat. Yet their presence also demonstrates the flexibility of the winter survival system. The same social networks that create hierarchy also create resilience when individual families or even entire bands face catastrophe. The broader community's investment in leadership and the concentration of resources in the hands of successful leaders allows for responses that might be impossible in a more egalitarian system. The winter of 1856 passed without major tragedy for Running Wolf's people, including the refugees, who were eventually integrated into the community's thermal and social networks. But the experience left its mark on the social structure of the band. New obligations had been created, new alliances formed, new hierarchies established, based on who had shared warmth and who had received it. By spring, when the lodges came down and the bands scattered to their summer hunting grounds, the map of winter warmth had been translated into a map of social relationships that would endure through the warm months and influence the composition of the next winter's camp. Those who had contributed fuel to the chief's lodge would remember their generosity. Those who had received warmth would remember their debt. The system was neither purely exploitative nor purely benevolent. It was adaptive, a way of organizing human communities to survive conditions that would be fatal to isolated individuals or rigidly equal groups. The concentration of winter warmth in the hands of leaders served functions that went beyond mere comfort. It preserved decision-making capacity, maintained social stability, provided resources for emergency response, and created incentives for the kinds of excellence in hunting, in warfare, in diplomacy that benefited the entire community. As the last embers die in Running Wolf's fire pit, as the lodge poles are taken down and packed for the move to spring camps, the warmth that has sustained his family through another winter becomes memory. But the relationships forged in that warmth, the obligations created by shared fuel and shared shelter, the hierarchies made visible by who slept comfortably and who merely survived. These continue to shape the community long after the snow melts and the prairie blooms with a new grass. The fire is gone, but its warmth lives on in the complex social bonds that will determine who gathers around next winter's flames, whose comfort will be prioritized, whose survival will be assured by the accumulated heat of human cooperation and calculated inequality. In the end, the chief's fire burned not just wood and buffalo chips, but the social relationships that made survival possible in a world where warmth was life itself. As Running Wolf's fire fades to memory and the complex warmth of winter hierarchies settles into the quiet spaces between then and now, let us drift back toward the simple miracle that has carried us through this long night's journey, the enduring human capacity to create comfort in the face of impossible cold. The wind still blows across the Great Plains tonight, just as it did in 1847 and 1856, in all those numberless winters when survival depended on knowledge held in weathered hands and wisdom passed down through generations like the most precious inheritance. But now that wind finds different shelters, different fires, different dreams of warmth, you are lying in your own bed now, in your own room, surrounded by walls that maintain their temperature through systems. You barely think about the furnace in your basement, the insulation in your walls, the windows that seal against the night. All of these work automatically, invisibly, to keep you comfortable. You adjust the thermostat with the casual gesture of someone who has never had to choose between staying warm and having enough fuel to last until morning. Yet somewhere in tonight's story, in the patient details of buffalo hide and carefully banked fires, of knowledge systems and social networks all focused on the simple goal of surviving until spring, you have touched something that your comfortable modern world has perhaps forgotten. You have felt, if only for a moment, what it means to earn warmth rather than simply expected. Think of young buffalo bird woman learning from her grandmother's careful hands how to read the signs of weather in the smoke from a fire, how to judge the quality of fuel by its sound, how to position stones so they would hold heat through the darkest hours. Think of her sleeping warm under buffalo robes while the temperature outside dropped to levels that would kill in minutes, kept alive not by technology but by knowledge, not by machines, but by the accumulated wisdom of people who understood their environment so intimately that a survival became an art form. Think of the archaeological mystery of those heating systems, sophisticated beyond anything we can fully reconstruct, efficient beyond what our measurements can explain. Somewhere, in the pattern of fire-stained stones and carefully positioned lodge, circles lies evidence of engineering principles that modern science is still trying to understand. Those ancient people were not primitive survivors huddling against the cold. They were environmental engineers whose understanding of thermodynamics, air circulation and thermal mass storage was so advanced, it left barely a trace for us to study and think of Running Wolf in his warm lodge, surrounded by the complex networks of obligation and reciprocity that turned individual survival into community resilience. His comfort was not selfish luxury, but social infrastructure. His warm fire, not just personal privilege, but the center around which the entire camp's survival strategy was organized. Even inequality in that harsh world served the larger purpose of keeping knowledge alive, keeping leadership functional, keeping communities intact through seasons that could destroy them. All of these stories, the daily struggle, the preserved wisdom, the mysterious technology, the complex social arrangements, all point toward a single simple truth that modern comfort sometimes obscures. Warmth is not automatic. Comfort is not inevitable. The ability to sleep soundly through a cold night is an achievement that requires knowledge, effort, cooperation, and respect for the forces that surround us. The people who slept warm in tipis understood something that our climate-controlled world has largely forgotten. That comfort comes from working with natural forces rather than against them, from understanding the environment rather than simply dominating it, from building communities that share both the work of survival and the warmth that makes life possible. But perhaps the deepest lesson of tonight's journey lies not in the specific techniques of tipi heating or the social structures of winter camps, but in the simple recognition that human ingenuity, when pressed by necessity and guided by accumulated wisdom, can create miracles of adaptation that seem impossible until you understand how they work. Those thin buffalo, hides stretched over wooden poles, should not have been able to shelter families. Through winters that killed exposed people in hours, those small fires should not have been able to warm spaces large enough for a dozen people when the outside temperature reached 40 below zero. Those apparently simple survival strategies should not have sustained complex, thriving societies across thousands of years of climatic variation. Yet they did, and in doing so, they demonstrated something about human capability that is worth remembering as you settle into your own warm bed tonight. We are creatures capable of extraordinary adaptation, remarkable cooperation, and ingenious solutions to problems that seem insurmountable. The warmth that surrounds you now, whether it comes from central heating or carefully banked fires, represents the culmination of countless generations of people solving the fundamental problem of how to stay alive when the world around them wanted to freeze them solid. The last ember of Running Wolf's fire went cold more than a century ago. The knowledge that Buffalo Bird Woman carried in her careful hands has been scattered to archives and field notes, preserved in fragments, but no longer living in the daily practice of survival. The mysterious heating systems that kept families warm through impossible winters have crumbled back into the earth, leaving only puzzling traces for archaeologists to ponder. But the essential truth remains constant as the stars that look down on those winter camps enduring, as the wind that still carries the scent of snow across. The endless grass. Human beings working together, sharing knowledge, caring for each other, can create islands of warmth and comfort in the coldest places imaginable. Tonight, as you close your eyes and let sleep carry you toward dreams, you carry with you the echo of all those other nights. Nights when staying warm required conscious effort, when comfort was earned through skill and cooperation, when the simple act of sleeping safely through until morning was a victory worth celebrating. The wind outside your window, if there is wind, carries no threat. The temperature, whatever it might be, cannot touch you. The darkness, however deep, holds no danger. You sleep in safety that those tipi dwellers could barely imagine, wrapped in comfort that their hardest work could only approximate. Yet in their struggle, in their success, in their patient accumulation of knowledge and wisdom and mutual care, they achieved something that transcends mere survival. They created, in the face of a world that seemed designed to kill them, not just warmth but home, not just survival but community, not just shelter, but the foundation for everything we call civilization. Rest easy tonight, knowing that the warmth that surrounds you, the safety that shelters you, the comfort that cradles you towards sleep, all rest on the accumulated efforts of countless generations who refused to let the cold wind, who found ways to keep the fire burning, who passed on to their children and their children's children the precious knowledge of how to stay warm in a cold world. The fire burns low. Now, the stones radiate their stored heat into the quiet darkness. Outside, winter waits with infinite patience, but inside, wrapped in the warmth of human ingenuity and care, sleep comes soft and safe and sound. The ember fades to ash. The night deepens toward dawn. The ancient knowledge settles into dreams. And somewhere in the space between memory and rest, the wisdom of staying warm carries you gently toward morning, just as it carried those hippie dwellers through all their long winter nights, just as it carries us all toward whatever warm shelter waits on the other side of sleep. Thank you for letting this slow walk through history be part of your night. Share 3 or 4 new calming stories every week, and if this one helped you rest, you're invited to subscribe. Another gentle adventure is waiting on the screen, or you can join our little community below. Good night.